In the year 1873, the township of Rincliffe lay quietly along the eastern rise of the Hudson River, a place where routine carried more weight than memory and silence often passed for order. The river itself moved steadily southward, indifferent to the affairs of those who lived beside it, its surface grey in the mornings and iron dark by dusk. Barges and passenger steamers passed at intervals, but they did not linger. Rincliffe was not a destination. It was a place one lived, endured, and left little mark upon. Most of the town's inhabitants belonged to families who had been there for generations. Their houses were built of stone or heavy timber, set back from narrow roads that followed the contours of the land rather than any plan. The days were structured by labor and habit. Men rose before dawn to tend fields, shops, or river work. Women kept houses, raised children, and managed quiet networks of obligation that held the community together without ceremony. Conversation remained practical. Questions were asked only when necessary. Curiosity, when indulged too openly, was regarded with suspicion. Church attendance marked the weeks more clearly than any calendar. The Dutch Reformed congregation met with predictable regularity, and even those who attended less out of belief than expectation understood the value of being seen. Sermons emphasized restraint, obedience, and the proper acceptance of one's place. There was little tolerance for excess of emotion, whether joy or sorrow. Both were considered private matters. Against this background, the arrival of Baron Heinrich von Strauss several years earlier had been received with measured interest. Wealth was not unknown in the Hudson Valley, but it usually announced itself quietly. The Baron did not. His purchase of the old Vandermeer mansion stood apart in scale and implication. The house itself had long been a landmark, its Gothic arches and tall tower visible from the river road, but it had been empty for years, its former owner dead without heirs, its rooms collecting dust and rumor in equal measure. When the Baron took possession of the estate, he brought activity with him. Wagons arrived daily during the first year, carrying stone, timber, furnishings, and crates marked with foreign names. Skilled laborers came from outside the township, men who spoke with accents unfamiliar to local ears. They worked long hours and asked few questions. When their work was finished, they departed just as quietly. The Baron himself was a man of deliberate presence. He dressed well, favored dark coats even in summer, and carried himself with a confidence that suggested expectation rather than request. He paid promptly and preferred gold to paper. This alone earned him a measure of respect among merchants who had lived through unstable financial years and remembered losses that had never been recovered. At first, his participation in local life appeared genuine. He attended church, though his manner of worship differed subtly from that of others. He listened intently, but his attention seemed directed inward rather than toward the pulpit. He made donations without public acknowledgement. He spoke politely, if formally, and asked questions that revealed careful observation. The household he assembled at the Vandermeer mansion was larger than any in town. Servants were hired from nearby villages and from the city. Their wages exceeded the customary rate, which discouraged inquiry. Employment of that sort did not invite questions, it silenced them. Those who worked for the Baron learned quickly that discretion was expected, not requested. The mansion itself, once reopened, became an object of both interest and unease. Its grounds were extensive and carefully maintained. Fences were repaired, hedges trimmed, paths laid with gravel brought from upriver. The tower, which had long been regarded as unnecessary ornament, was reinforced and refitted. Windows were replaced with thick glass. Locks were installed where none had existed before. Inside, rooms were reorganized according to the Baron's priorities. The ballroom on the ground floor received the most attention. Floors were refinished, walls adjusted for sound, ceilings repainted with images drawn from classical themes unfamiliar to most residents. Few locals saw this work directly. Invitations were extended selectively, and attendance at the musical gatherings that followed became a mark of distinction. For a time, these evenings brought activity and conversation back into Rincliffe. Carriages lined the drive on performance nights. Guests arrived dressed for occasion rather than necessity. Music filled the ballroom, and afterward, voices carried late into the evening as dinners were served and discussions continued. The Baron presided over these events with visible satisfaction. Yet even during this period of apparent openness, the balance of power remained clear. The house was his, the music was his, those who entered did so by invitation and left when expected. The servants moved through these gatherings silently, avoiding eye contact, responding to gestures rather than words. Daily life at the estate followed a rigid schedule. Meals were prepared at fixed hours. Practice sessions occurred behind closed doors. Servants were assigned specific areas and instructed not to deviate from them. The upper floors, particularly the east wing and tower, were understood to be restricted without explanation. In town, routine continued much as before, but with subtle alterations. The servants who once spoke freely at the market no longer did. They completed their errands quickly and returned to the estate without lingering. When asked after their employer, they answered with neutral phrases that conveyed nothing. Their posture had changed, shoulders drawn slightly inward, eyes lowered. As summer turned toward autumn, the rhythm of the Baron's gatherings slowed. Invitations became less frequent. Performances continued, but without the accompanying dinners. Guests were received and dismissed with efficiency rather than warmth. Conversation narrowed. The Baron spoke less to those around him and more about the music itself, its necessity, its purity, its vulnerability to misuse. Outside the mansion, life in Rincliffe remained governed by repetition. Fields were harvested, boats came and went. Children walked the same roads to school each morning. From certain points along the river road, the tower of the Vandermeer mansion could be seen rising above the trees, its windows catching light at odd hours. At night, a single lamp burned in that tower with unwavering consistency. It did not flicker, it did not dim, it remained lit regardless of weather or season. Some found reassurance in its constancy. Others found it troubling, though few could say why. Silence settled gradually, not as an event, but as an accumulation. The absence of music was noted first, then the absence of visitors, then the absence of explanation. In a town accustomed to knowing its own affairs, this absence created a quiet tension that had no outlet. People noticed and did not speak. They remembered and did not ask. By the close of autumn, the Vandermeer mansion had become still. Its gates remained closed. Its servants moved like shadows. The tower light continued to burn. Nothing had yet occurred that could be named a crime. Nothing had been proven. Life continued, as it always had, with work and weather and silence. But beneath that continuity, something had shifted. The balance that allowed people to believe they understood their place in the order of things had been disturbed. And in Rincliffe, disturbance did not announce itself loudly. It waited. The first signs were not dramatic. They did not arrive with raised voices or sudden violence. They emerged instead through small denials, omissions that could be explained away individually, but which together formed a pattern that unsettled those who paid attention. In Rincliffe, authority had long worn a familiar face. It belonged to landowners, merchants, ministers, and men whose names appeared regularly on deeds and donation lists. Power did not need to assert itself openly. It rested in expectations and habits, in who was believed and who was not, in which questions were considered appropriate and which were quietly discouraged. Baron Heinrich von Strauss had entered this structure without difficulty. His wealth granted him immediate credibility. His foreign title, whether genuine or not, carried weight among those who valued hierarchy. When he spoke, people listened. When he withdrew, they assumed it was his right to do so. The first murmurs began among those who had attended the musical evenings most frequently. They noticed that the soprano, Margherita Bellini, no longer moved freely among guests, where she had once stood alone after performances, receiving applause with composed acknowledgement. She now remained close to the Baron, her movements constrained not by physical barriers but by proximity. If she spoke, it was briefly. If she was addressed directly, the Baron often answered for her. These observations were shared cautiously, often framed as concern rather than accusation. People spoke in conditional language. Perhaps she was unwell, perhaps she was shy, perhaps the strain of performance required protection. Each explanation offered reassurance and removed the need for further inquiry. Yet the changes continued. Invitations to speak with her privately were deflected. Requests for interviews from visiting critics were denied or redirected. The Baron cited concern for her health, her voice, her sensitivity. He spoke of singers ruined by public exposure, of talent squandered by careless managers. His language emphasized guardianship rather than control, though the distinction grew increasingly thin. Those closest to the stage noticed other details. Margarita's posture had altered. Where she had once held herself with quiet assurance, she now appeared rigid, as if bracing herself. Her gaze seldom lifted beyond the middle distance. When it did, it moved quickly, as though searching and then retreating. In early September, one of the town's more observant residents, Catherine Brennan, found herself unsettled by these changes. She had lived in Rincliffe all her life and had learned to read the unspoken signals that governed social life. She recognized fear when she saw it, even when it was carefully concealed. Mrs. Brennan approached Margarita after a performance under the pretense of offering congratulations. Her words were ordinary, polite, unremarkable. The response she received was equally restrained, but in the brief moment when their eyes met, Mrs. Brennan saw something that troubled her deeply. It was not merely fatigue or shyness. It was the look of someone who understood the limits of what could be said and feared the consequences of exceeding them. When the Baron intervened, his manner was outwardly courteous. His hand rested on Margarita's arm with an intimacy that suggested familiarity rather than affection. His explanation for ending the conversation was delivered smoothly, but his grip lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Mrs. Brennan noticed the tension in Margarita's shoulders, the way her breath caught before she stepped back. Later, Mrs. Brennan mentioned the encounter to her husband, Sheriff Thomas Brennan. She described it carefully, without embellishment. She did not accuse the Baron of wrongdoing. She did not claim certainty. She spoke only of unease, of something that felt wrong but could not yet be named. The sheriff listened without interruption. He had learned over years of service that intuition, particularly his wife's, often signaled problems before evidence appeared. Still, intuition alone could not justify action. In a town like Rincliffe, accusations carried consequences, and those consequences often fell hardest on the accuser. Meanwhile, within the Vandermeer mansion, the daily routine tightened further. Servants were given explicit instructions regarding movement and speech. Areas of the house that had once been accessible were now restricted. Doors were locked where they had previously stood open. The upper floors became entirely off-limits to most of the staff. Mrs. Greta Hoffman, the housekeeper, enforced these rules without explanation. Her demeanor grew harsher, her patience shorter. She watched the other servants closely, correcting even minor deviations from instruction. Those who asked questions were reminded of their employment terms. Wages were generous, but they were not unconditional. One of the cooks later recalled that during this period, meals prepared for the household began to change. Portions sent upstairs were smaller than before. Foods that required little chewing or effort to swallow were requested more frequently. These changes were noted but not discussed. It was not the cook's place to inquire, and she understood that clearly. In town, speculation increased quietly. The absence of public performances after October was explained as illness. The Baron informed those who asked that Margarita required rest, that her voice had been strained, that recovery demanded silence. This explanation was accepted outwardly, though it did not account for the complete withdrawal from public view. Winter approached, bringing shorter days and longer nights. With it came isolation. The Vandermeer mansion, already set apart by distance and elevation, became further removed as snow and ice made travel difficult. The road that passed below the estate remained open, but few had reason to use it after dark. It was during this time that reports of singing began to circulate. At first, they were dismissed as imagination. Children walking home from school claimed to hear a woman's voice carried on the wind. Adults attributed these stories to idle fancy, to echoes, to the natural tendency of sound to distort across open land. Yet some of those adults admitted in private that they too had heard something, not clearly, not consistently, but often enough to make dismissal uncomfortable. The sound was always the same, a single voice, repeating phrases rather than performing complete pieces. It lacked the fullness of the earlier concerts. It sounded constrained, as though confined by walls or distance. When these observations reached Sheriff Brennan, he noted them without comment. He understood the danger of rumor. He also understood the danger of ignoring patterns. Still, without a complaint, without a witness willing to speak openly, his authority extended no further than observation. The Baron's behavior in town changed as well. He appeared less frequently and stayed for shorter periods. When he did conduct business, he did so efficiently, without the social exchanges that had once accompanied his visits. He no longer attended church. He no longer accepted invitations. His interactions were limited to necessity. Those who encountered him during this period remarked on his intensity. His gaze seemed fixed inward. His patience for delay or error diminished. He spoke sharply to clerks and tradesmen, correcting them for minor mistakes. He appeared preoccupied, as though managing a matter that demanded constant attention. Within the household, fear became palpable. Servants avoided eye contact, not only with the Baron, but with one another. Conversations were brief and conducted in whispers, if at all. No one lingered in shared spaces. Each person confined themselves to assigned duties and routes, minimizing the chance of being noticed. The injustice of the situation was not yet articulated, but it was felt. It existed in the imbalance between authority and vulnerability, in the way explanations flowed only in one direction, in the ease with which wealth converted suspicion into silence. Those who sensed it struggled with their own hesitation. To speak without certainty risked ridicule or reprisal. To remain silent felt increasingly like complicity. Most chose silence, telling themselves that it was not their place to intervene, that they lacked proof, that others would act if action were necessary. This was how injustice first took root in Rincliffe, not through overt cruelty, but through the gradual normalization of control, through the quiet acceptance of explanations that required no verification, through the assumption that power, when exercised discreetly, must also be exercised legitimately. By the time winter settled fully over the Hudson Valley, fear had begun to circulate beneath the surface of daily life. It did not announce itself openly. It moved instead through glances, pauses, and the careful avoidance of certain topics. And in the tower above the Vandermeer mansion, the light continued to burn each night, unwavering, marking the presence of something that no one could yet name, but which many had begun to dread. The injustice had not yet revealed its full shape, but its outline was becoming visible to those willing to look. By the opening weeks of the new year, control within the Vandermeer mansion no longer relied solely on instruction. It had settled into structure. What had once been enforced through spoken rules now existed as habit, expectation, and fear. The household functioned with mechanical regularity, each person moving within narrow limits that were never written but thoroughly understood. The servants rose before dawn. Fires were lit, floors swept, water carried, tasks were completed in silence. Mrs. Hoffman inspected the work with sharp attention, correcting without explanation. Her presence had changed. Where she had once carried herself with professional reserve, she now appeared strained, her movements abrupt, her face drawn. She slept poorly. Those who passed her in corridors noticed her hands trembling when she thought no one was watching. No one spoke of the tower. Food continued to be prepared 3 times daily. Trays were assembled according to written instructions kept in the butler's pantry. Portions were measured precisely. Certain foods were excluded entirely. Bread was limited. Meat appeared rarely. Liquids were emphasized. These details were noticed, but not questioned. The housekeeper alone carried the trays upstairs. She refused assistance even when her illness worsened, even when her cough deepened and her steps became unsteady. When the trays returned, the dishes were often untouched or only partially so. Food cooled and congealed. Sometimes it bore signs of having been pushed aside rather than consumed. These observations were absorbed quietly, like all the rest. The other servants avoided the staircase that led upward. They did not look toward it. They did not pause near it. The house itself seemed to narrow as one approached that section, corridors growing darker, ceilings lower, air heavier. The sense of exclusion was not merely physical, it was psychological. The upper floors existed beyond permission. In town, the winter deepened. Snow lay thick along the roads. The river slowed, edged with ice. Travel became difficult, and with difficulty came isolation. People remained indoors more frequently, gathering in small groups for warmth and company. It was during these gatherings that concern found limited expression. Conversations returned repeatedly to the same unanswered questions. Where was the singer? Why had she left so abruptly? Why did the Baron no longer participate in public life? Each question was followed by an explanation already offered and already doubted. Illness, travel, privacy. Sheriff Brennan continued to receive occasional remarks from townspeople. None of them rose to the level of complaint. None named a crime. They described only impressions, sounds at night, a sense of wrongness. The sheriff listened and recorded nothing. He understood that to act prematurely would risk failure. He also understood that waiting carried its own danger. Pressure began to build not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Each unanswered question added weight. Each denial increased strain. The Baron's authority was no longer supported by goodwill or novelty. It rested now solely on his resources and his distance. The Baron himself became more rigid. His visits to town grew even shorter. When he appeared, he avoided conversation. He conducted his business with minimal words, his attention fixed elsewhere. Those who interacted with him noticed that he no longer tolerated delay. His temper flared quickly, then vanished just as abruptly, leaving behind discomfort rather than resolution. Within the mansion, sound took on new significance. Footsteps were measured, doors closed softly. Even the crackle of the fire seemed loud in certain rooms. And above it all, at intervals that grew increasingly predictable, there was singing. It came in fragments, scales repeated again and again, short passages practiced without variation, always the same keys, always the same phrases. It lacked the shape of performance. It sounded instead like compulsion, like repetition imposed rather than chosen. On nights when the wind carried sound downward toward the road, those keeping watch from a distance could hear it faintly. The voice was unmistakably human. It was also unmistakably constrained. It rose and fell within narrow limits, never swelling, never resolving. It did not invite listening. It endured it. Those who heard it described a sense of discomfort that lingered long after the sound faded. It was not merely sadness. It was the awareness of something being used against its will. Inside the tower, time had lost ordinary meaning. Days were measured by light and dark, by meals delivered and removed, by the Baron's arrival and departure. Practice occurred when he demanded it. Silence occurred when he permitted it. Rest was irregular and incomplete. The rules governing this existence were not negotiable. They had been established gradually, enforced through correction, punishment, and isolation. Resistance had narrowed options until compliance became the only viable path. The Baron's obsession hardened into routine. He no longer hosted. He no longer shared. He no longer explained. His world had contracted to the tower room and the voice within it. Everything else existed only insofar as it supported that focus. Fear spread outward from this center. Mrs. Hoffman bore its weight most visibly. Her role placed her between authority and victim, enforcing rules she did not create and witnessing suffering she could not admit. She justified her actions through necessity, through obedience, through the belief that refusal would only worsen the situation. Each day made reversal more difficult. The injustice at the heart of the mansion was no longer subtle. It had crossed from implication into reality. A person's freedom had been replaced by another's control. Choice had been replaced by command. Art had been reduced to property. Yet even now, the structure held. There were still no witnesses willing to speak publicly. There were still explanations that could be offered. There was still enough distance between suspicion and proof to delay action. Pressure continued to build. It built in the tightening routines of the household, in the Baron's increasing isolation, in the repetition of the voice above the river, in the knowledge, shared by a growing number of people, that something irreversible was approaching. The system sustaining the injustice required constant maintenance. It demanded silence, compliance, and fear. and like all such systems, it grew more fragile as it grew more rigid. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was being approached steadily and without deviation. The crossing did not announce itself with spectacle. There was no single cry heard by the whole town, no sudden disturbance that forced immediate reckoning. Instead, the line was crossed in a confined space, behind stone walls and locked doors, where authority no longer pretended to be benevolent and restraint gave way to punishment. The final public performance in October had already revealed the strain. Those present sensed it, even if they could not articulate it clearly. The soprano's voice, once marked by control and depth, had wavered. The flaw was slight, almost imperceptible, but to the man who claimed ownership over that voice, it was intolerable. After the guests departed and the house emptied of witnesses, the Baron did not follow his usual routine. He did not return to the door to see off carriages. He did not linger in conversation. Instead, he turned inward, moving through the mansion with purpose, his attention narrowed to a single point. Raised voices were heard later that night by those still within the house. They did not echo far. The walls absorbed them as they were built to do. What could be heard was tone rather than words, one voice sharp and commanding, the other strained, uneven, breaking at intervals. By morning, the structure of life within the mansion had changed permanently. The soprano was no longer permitted access to the ballroom, the gardens, or any shared space. Her quarters were relocated to the East Tower, a room previously used for storage and observation. It was small and sparsely furnished. The window was high and narrow. The door was solid oak, reinforced with a new lock installed by a craftsman brought from outside the township. The move was presented as necessity, privacy, recovery, protection. These explanations were offered only to those who asked, and few did. Within the household, the change was accepted without comment. The servants understood what questions would cost them. At first, the confinement was partial. The door was locked only at night. During the day, the Baron permitted supervised movement within the tower room. Practice continued, now isolated from the acoustics of the ballroom. The sound changed accordingly, flattened by stone and distance. Meals were delivered without conversation. Instructions were delivered without explanation. Corrections were enforced immediately. Resistance was met with consequence. When the soprano objected, when she asked to leave, when she spoke of returning home or performing elsewhere, the Baron responded not with argument, but with withdrawal. He denied food. He denied rest. He denied silence. He required repetition until exhaustion made refusal impossible. It was during this period that the chains were introduced. They were not immediately visible to those outside the tower. They were applied gradually, first at night, then during the day. The explanation given, when one was given at all, was safety, the suggestion of instability. The implication that the restraint was for her own good. The iron cuffs were fitted carefully. They were sized to prevent removal but allow limited movement. The chain was short enough to restrict access to the door and window while permitting packing within the room. The bolt anchoring it to the floor was set deeply into stone. This act marked the moment when the situation ceased to be coercive and became unequivocally criminal. The pretense of guardianship collapsed. What remained was ownership enforced by force. Inside the tower, time contracted further. Singing became compulsory rather than scheduled. It occurred at the Baron's command, often late into the night. He corrected relentlessly, interrupting at the slightest deviation. He demanded repetition of the same passages again and again until the voice grew hoarse and unsteady. Silence was permitted only as recovery, not as relief. The soprano's body began to reflect the conditions of her confinement. Weight fell away, strength diminished. The skin around the cuffs broke and healed repeatedly, leaving scars that did not fade. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by instruction or expectation. Attempts to resist were met with escalation. When she refused to sing, the Baron withheld food. When she attempted to escape, he tightened control. The threat of violence was made explicit. The threat of death was implied often enough to require no elaboration. Outside the tower, the household adjusted. Mrs. Hoffman took on the role of intermediary. She delivered food, collected dishes, and maintained the fiction of absence. She accepted payment in silence and told herself that obedience was preferable to defiance. Each day reinforced that belief, even as it hollowed it out. Other servants learned to avert their attention entirely. The sounds from above were not acknowledged. The smell of medicines carried down stairwells was ignored. The locked doors became part of the house's architecture rather than evidence of wrongdoing. In town, the absence of the soprano became accepted fact. Explanations hardened into assumption. Those who still questioned were met with impatience. It was not considered appropriate to speculate about a private household, particularly one owned by a man of means. Winter sealed the isolation. Snow made travel difficult. Cold discouraged movement. The mansion became a self-contained world, governed by rules known fully only to those within. It was during this season that the singing changed again. It lost what little variation remained. It became mechanical, stripped of interpretation. The voice endured rather than expressed. Those who heard it from a distance remarked on its sameness, its repetition, its refusal to resolve. The injustice was now complete. A person had been reduced to an instrument. Her labor was extracted under threat. Her identity was overwritten by another's desire. No record documented this transformation. No authority intervened. No witness spoke openly. The line, once crossed, was not acknowledged by those who benefited from ignoring it. But it existed nonetheless, fixed and irrevocable, marked not by law or proclamation, but by iron set into stone, and a voice compelled to sound within reach of no one but its captor. From that point forward, the outcome could only move in one direction. Resistance did not begin with defiance. It emerged instead through memory, attention, and the refusal to fully accept what was being presented as inevitable. Those who resisted did so quietly, often without naming their actions as such. In Rincliffe, open opposition to power was rare. Survival had taught people to move carefully, to observe before acting, and to preserve themselves where possible. For Margarita Santoro, resistance took its first form in remembering who she had been before confinement reshaped her days. In the tower room, alone for long stretches of time, she repeated names silently, places, churches where she had sung as a child, streets in Naples where voices carried openly and without permission. She clung to these memories not as comfort, but as proof that another life had existed and therefore could exist again. She learned to preserve her strength where possible. She sang when commanded, but she conserved breath in moments of reprieve. She drank water slowly, deliberately. She rested when allowed, even if sleep came shallow and broken. These acts were small and easily overlooked, but they were intentional. Her voice, though constrained, retained its discipline. Even under coercion, she maintained technique. This was not obedience so much as control over what remained hers. The Baron believed he commanded her voice, but he did not fully understand it. He demanded sound, not health. She understood that distinction and guarded it. Elsewhere in the household, resistance manifested differently. Mrs. Hoffman's complicity weighed heavily on her. She continued to perform her duties, but the certainty that had once justified her actions began to erode. Each trip to the tower reinforced the reality she had worked to deny. Each untouched plate, each visible wound beneath the iron cuffs, each strained breath she overheard outside the door added to a growing burden that payment could no longer offset. She began to hesitate. It was subtle, a pause before turning the key, a moment's delay before reporting completion of tasks. These hesitations were brief and easily dismissed, but they signaled a shift. Obedience remained, but belief did not. The other servants noticed these changes without discussing them. They learned to read Mrs. Hoffman's expression as a measure of danger. When her face hardened, they retreated. When it softened, they understood something had occurred above that no one would explain. Outside the mansion, resistance took the form of observation. Emma Kowalski's time at the estate had been brief, but it had left an impression that did not fade. She carried the memory of the locked door and the pleading voice with her even after she fled. Fear kept her silent at first. The Baron's threat had been explicit and believable. Her family depended on stability, and she could not risk their livelihood. Yet silence proved costly, sleep came poorly, guilt intruded into ordinary moments. She found herself listening for sounds that were not there, imagining calls that went unanswered. The injustice she had glimpsed refused to remain contained. Eventually, the weight of that knowledge exceeded her fear. When she spoke, she did so not publicly, but privately to Father Michael O'Brien. The choice of confessor was deliberate. He was young, not yet fully absorbed into the town's hierarchy. He listened without interruption and without immediate judgment. Her account was careful and restrained. She described only what she had seen and heard: the locked door, the voice, the Baron's response. She did not speculate beyond that. She did not dramatize. The facts themselves carried sufficient gravity. Father O'Brien understood the limits of his authority. He also understood his obligation. He did not promise immediate action. He did not raise expectations he could not meet. Instead, he began to listen more closely to the town around him, to patterns and omissions he had previously accepted. He spoke discreetly with parishioners. He asked casual questions. He noted inconsistencies. When explanations were offered too quickly or with unusual defensiveness, he remembered them. Sheriff Brennan, too, continued to observe. His wife's concerns had not diminished. They had sharpened. She spoke of the injustice not as rumor, but as certainty without evidence. The sheriff knew better than to dismiss her, but he also knew the constraints of his office. What resistance required, he understood, was proof. Within the tower, Margarita began to take risks. She spoke when she believed someone might hear. She tested the limits of the walls and the wind. Her calls were brief and carefully timed. She conserved her voice for moments when it might matter. She learned patterns. She learned when the Baron would be absent, when Mrs. Hoffman would be delayed, when the household was quiet enough for sound to carry. Each attempt was a gamble, but remaining silent guaranteed nothing. The response she received was never immediate. Sometimes there was none at all, but on one occasion she sensed movement beyond the door. A pause, a hesitation, proof that she had been heard, even if help did not follow. These acts of resistance did not weaken the system immediately. Power remained firmly in the Baron's hands. The structure he had built continued to function, but resistance altered the trajectory. It introduced instability. Those who resisted remembered details. They recorded dates. They noted times. They shared information cautiously. Each small act created a thread that, taken alone, seemed fragile, but together began to form a record. The injustice was no longer entirely contained within the tower. It had begun to surface through memory and witness, through people who refused to forget what they had seen, even when forgetting would have been easier. Quiet resistance does not announce itself. It accumulates, it waits, it prepares. And in Rincliffe, that preparation was underway, unnoticed by the man who believed control was complete. When concern finally reached institutions capable of response, it was met not with urgency, but with caution. Authority in Rincliffe did not deny injustice outright. Instead, it deferred, redirected, and absorbed it into procedure until its force diminished. Sheriff Brennan's first formal inquiry was deliberate and restrained. He approached it not as an accusation, but as a request for clarification. This choice was not born of cowardice, but of experience. He understood the limits of his position and the consequences of exceeding them without incontrovertible evidence. The Baron received the sheriff with courtesy that bordered on formality. The meeting took place in a study designed to impress. Books lined the walls, many of them in languages the sheriff could not read. Paintings of European landscapes hung in heavy frames. Everything in the room communicated legitimacy, education, and control. The Baron listened without interruption as the sheriff explained that there had been questions regarding Miss Bellini's sudden absence. He did not react immediately. When he did speak, his tone was calm and measured. He expressed regret that such concerns had arisen, but assured the sheriff that they were unfounded. He explained that Miss Bellini had departed for Italy to attend to family matters. He described the urgency of the situation, the need for discretion, the impracticality of public farewells. He presented letters written in Italian, bearing a feminine hand, expressing gratitude and describing life abroad. The sheriff examined them briefly, unable to verify their authenticity. When asked about reports of singing heard at night, the Baron smiled faintly. He gestured toward a cabinet containing an elaborate music box. He wound it carefully and allowed it to play. The sound was mechanical, thin, and precise. He suggested that, at a distance, such sounds could easily be mistaken for something else. The explanation was plausible. It was also sufficient. Institutions rely on sufficiency. They require evidence that can be documented, verified, and defended. Suspicion alone does not compel action. The sheriff left the estate dissatisfied but constrained. He had no legal basis to proceed further. Father O'Brien encountered similar resistance. When he inquired on behalf of Miss Bellini, he was met with polite dismissal. He was reminded that the Baron was a benefactor, a man of standing. He was advised not to indulge in speculation. His role, it was suggested, lay elsewhere. The institutional response did not deny the possibility of wrongdoing. It simply refused to recognize it without proof. This refusal had the effect of isolating those who sensed injustice, forcing them to choose between silence and risk. Within the mansion, denial took a more immediate form. The Baron reinforced his control. He tightened routines. He increased surveillance within the household. He reminded Mrs. Hoffman of her obligations, not through threats, but through implication. He spoke of loyalty, of discretion, of consequences that need not be specified. The housekeeper complied outwardly. Inwardly, her resolve weakened. She began to understand that institutional denial protected the Baron, not her. Her participation, once rationalized as employment, now carried legal and moral weight she could not ignore. The other servants withdrew further. They avoided eye contact with visitors. They spoke only when spoken to. Their silence became a shield. In the tower, denial manifested as insistence. The Baron refused to acknowledge Margarita's suffering as suffering. He reframed it as necessity, discipline, care. When she spoke of pain, he spoke of sacrifice. When she spoke of freedom, he spoke of protection. He convinced himself fully. This conviction allowed him to dismiss evidence that contradicted his narrative. It allowed him to ignore the visible consequences of his actions. It allowed him to believe that authority justified everything. Institutional denial extended beyond the town. When inquiries were made at regional offices, they stalled. Letters were redirected. Responsibility was deferred. The Baron's connections ensured that questions lost momentum before they required answers. This denial was not coordinated through conspiracy. It was systemic. Each individual acted within perceived limits, passing responsibility upward or outward. No one made a decision that appeared overtly wrong. No one intervened decisively. As a result, the injustice persisted. For those resisting quietly, this denial clarified what remained necessary. Proof would have to be undeniable. It would have to come from within the system or overwhelm it. Observation intensified. Records were kept more carefully. Dates and times were noted. Witnesses were identified and protected where possible. The injustice was documented in fragments, waiting for the moment when those fragments could be assembled into something that institutions could no longer ignore. Denial had delayed action. It had not eliminated the truth. The structure protecting the Baron depended on silence and plausibility. Both were eroding. And with each night, the light burned in the tower. With each repetition of the same constrained phrases carried faintly across the winter air, the cost of denial grew heavier for everyone involved. The institutions had chosen not to act. That choice, too, would have consequences. Truth did not emerge suddenly. It surfaced unevenly, through accumulation rather than revelation, through the convergence of records, witnesses, and circumstance that no longer aligned with denial. What had been sustained by plausibility began to fail under weight. The first fracture came not from accusation, but from recognition. Father Michael O'Brien encountered it in a place far removed from Rincliffe, in a crowded hall south along the river where a travelling opera company had taken temporary residence. He attended not out of leisure, but habit, maintaining connection to the cultural world that had first drawn his attention to the missing soprano. He listened carefully, as he always did, noting technique, phrasing, and lineage. When the tenor sang, O'Brien recognized more than skill. He recognized resemblance, not physical likeness alone, but something in the shaping of sound, in the breath and phrasing that suggested shared training. When he spoke with the man afterward, cautiously and in broken Italian, a name passed between them that shifted everything. Margherita Santoro. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Shock registered first, then urgency. The tenor did not hesitate. He asked where she was. He asked whether she lived. He spoke not of absence, but of disappearance. In a quiet room away from the hall, the truth began to assemble. The name Bellini was false. The letters were lies. The return to Italy had never occurred. The father had been dead for years. The final letter from his sister had spoken of fear and confinement, of permission denied and movement restricted. Then silence. This testimony changed the nature of what had been suspected. It replaced implication with continuity. It connected the voice in the tower to a life beyond it, to family, to verifiable absence. Father O'Brien returned to Rincliffe with urgency he did not attempt to conceal. He spoke first to Sheriff Brennan, not as a concerned priest, but as a bearer of corroboration. He brought the tenor's account. He brought copies of letters preserved by the family. He brought a photograph. The sheriff listened without interruption. He recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer rumor or intuition. This was evidence of deception sustained over time. This was the absence of a person who could be located nowhere else. Action followed, but cautiously. The sheriff understood that exposure without preparation could still fail. The Baron's narrative had been practiced and rehearsed. It required a confrontation that could not be deflected. Surveillance increased. Movement at the estate was recorded with precision. Times were logged. Patterns confirmed. The Baron's nightly ascent to the tower was noted. The duration of his stays measured. The absence of other witnesses documented. Winter pressed hard, and with it came an unexpected development. Illness weakened the housekeeper. Mrs. Hoffman's condition deteriorated rapidly. When a physician was called to the estate, he heard what others had heard but dismissed: a human voice, repetition, distress. Unlike others, the physician recognized it. His training and familiarity with music allowed him to distinguish between mechanism and breath. He did not accept the explanation offered. He did not voice accusation immediately. He observed. Afterward, he reported his concern to the sheriff. Medical testimony carried weight that rumor did not. Combined with the accumulating record, it created a narrow opening for lawful intervention. The opportunity came through procedure rather than force. A public health order was drafted, justified by the presence of illness and the risk of contagion. It was legal if strained. It required examination of all residents within the estate, no exceptions. When the sheriff returned to the Vandermeer mansion with the physician and deputies, the Baron recognized the shift. His composure held, but his control tightened visibly. He objected formally, not violently. He insisted on presence. He insisted on order. He could not refuse. The ascent to the tower was slow. The staircase was narrow. The air grew stale with each step. When the door opened, denial collapsed under sight. The woman in the room was unmistakably human, unmistakably alive, and unmistakably imprisoned. Her condition required no interpretation. The restraints were visible. The injuries were evident. Her body bore the marks of prolonged deprivation. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. She named her captivity without embellishment. She named the threats. She named the falsehoods. This testimony could not be absorbed into procedure. It exceeded explanation. The Baron attempted interruption. He attempted reassertion. He attempted justification. When he moved toward her, force replaced authority. He was restrained. The system he had relied upon failed in the presence of undeniable fact. Removal followed methodically. The chains were documented before they were removed. The room was recorded. The locks were noted. The housekeeper's role was addressed without spectacle. News traveled quickly, but not cleanly. Newspapers reduced complexity to narrative. Conversations in town filled with details previously unspoken. Those who had doubted felt vindicated. Those who had remained silent felt exposed. Truth, once surfaced, did not resolve cleanly. It unsettled. The soprano was taken into care. Her brother was summoned. Their reunion was private. No one present spoke of it publicly. It was understood that some moments did not belong to record. The Baron was held pending trial. His protests continued. He did not deny the facts. He reinterpreted them. Ownership, he insisted, had been mistaken for cruelty, protection for imprisonment, art for entitlement. The trial that followed formalized what had already been revealed. Evidence accumulated rather than astonished. The verdict was reached without deliberation prolonged enough to suggest doubt. Truth had surfaced not because the system functioned efficiently, but because it failed to suppress convergence. What had been hidden through wealth and structure emerged through witness and persistence. It did not restore what had been taken. It did not erase harm. But it ended concealment. And in Rincliffe, that alone altered the balance that had allowed injustice to endure. The aftermath unfolded without ceremony. There were no public reckonings that satisfied every observer, no sense that balance had been restored in full. What followed was slower and more uneven, shaped by recovery, memory, and the quiet persistence of consequence. Margarita Santoro did not return immediately to public life. Her removal from the tower marked an end to captivity, but not an end to its effects. Her body required careful attention. Malnutrition had weakened her organs. Infection lingered in wounds that had never been allowed to heal properly. The physician attended to these injuries methodically, aware that haste would cause harm. Recovery proceeded in measured stages. Weight returned gradually. Strength followed more slowly. Sleep came unevenly. Certain sounds triggered involuntary responses. Doors closing sharply, footsteps on stairs, even the rustle of fabric could cause her to stiffen, her breathing shallow and rapid until reassurance intervened. Her voice remained intact, but its use did not come easily. For weeks, she avoided speaking at length. Singing was unthinkable. The instrument that had once been an expression of identity had been transformed into a tool of confinement. Reclaiming it required more than physical healing. Her brother stayed close. He did not press her to explain what she had endured. He spoke when she wished to listen and remained silent when she did not. This steadiness mattered more than encouragement. It allowed her to regain a sense of control without demand. In town, reactions varied. Some expressed outrage openly, speaking of betrayal and cruelty as though they had not ignored earlier signs. Others avoided the subject entirely, uncomfortable with their own inaction. A few attempted to rationalize what had occurred, emphasizing the Baron's isolation, his eccentricity, as though explanation might soften responsibility. The sheriff endured scrutiny as well. Some questioned why intervention had taken so long. Others defended his caution. He did not engage in public debate. He understood that institutional limits did not absolve moral consequence, but neither did they yield easily to retrospective judgment. The housekeeper faced her own reckoning. Her sentence was lighter than many expected. Cooperation and testimony had been considered mitigating. Even so, she left Rincliffe shortly after serving it. No farewell marked her departure. Her role in the injustice remained a subject of quiet discussion, never fully resolved in the minds of those who considered it. The mansion on the hill did not remain occupied. Legal proceedings tied it up for months. When it was finally sold, the new owners made extensive changes. The tower was dismantled stone by stone. The room that had held the chains ceased to exist. No marker remained to indicate what had occurred there. Yet absence did not erase memory. For years afterward, people in Rincliffe avoided the subject unless prompted. Children grew up hearing fragments, never the full account. Adults who had lived through it remembered details differently, emphasizing certain moments and minimizing others. The story shifted depending on who told it, but its core remained unchanged. Margherita and her brother returned to Italy once her health allowed. She did not resume a professional career. This decision disappointed some who had admired her talent, but it was not open to negotiation. Singing, when it returned, did so privately. It belonged again to choice rather than obligation. She married later quietly. She lived without public attention. Those who knew her afterward described her as reserved, attentive, and deliberate. The scars on her ankles remained. They were not concealed, but neither were they explained. They existed as fact rather than symbol. The Baron did not adapt to confinement. He rejected routine and resisted authority. His health declined. He maintained his version of events until the end, insisting that he had been misunderstood, that possession had been mistaken for devotion. Remorse never entered his account. His death passed without notice, beyond a brief entry in official records. What remained was not justice in any complete sense, but consequence. Rincliffe did not change dramatically as a result of what had occurred. Power continued to operate quietly, wealth continued to shape outcomes, but something had shifted in the town's collective awareness. Silence was no longer assumed to be harmless. Absence was no longer automatically explained away. The injustice had ended not through sudden moral awakening, but through endurance, record, and the convergence of witness. It served as a reminder, rarely spoken, but often remembered, that harm does not require chaos to persist. It requires only structure, permission, and the willingness of others to look away. When people reflected on the events years later, they did not speak of triumph. They spoke of failure, survival, and the cost of delay. And that was the true aftermath.